Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
I'm here today with Jamie Freeman, who's an Associate Director of the Baptist Union of New South Wales and the ACT. Jamie, thanks for giving up your time today and also being available to impart some of your wisdom and also experience and the vision for what you're doing in New South Wales. I really appreciate that. Can we start off by, would you mind just describing your role? What role in the Baptist Union do you have?
Sure, Tim. It's great to be able to chat with you today, despite the fact that we're in lockdown here in New South Wales. But so my role with the Baptist Association is in the area of mission and church development. So we have a few different teams in that space. So that incorporates our global mission team, where we're partnered with Global Interaction. So we're sending people overseas and connecting them with churches locally in terms of resourcing around prayer and finance and what that looks like. And then equipping our churches, how do they engage with people from different culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds at home here. So there's that element. We've got our church multiplication team. We have our church witness team, where we bring together the evangelism arm and the social justice, the community engagement space. And we talk about that through the lens of church witness. And then we also have the church health team. And I think for us, healthy churches are engaged in all of those things. They're engaged in mission locally and globally. They're involved in church multiplication, and they're involved in church witness. So my role is to support those team leaders as they support their teams, as they support our association of churches.
No, that's great, Jamie. Jamie, I've read your document, A Blended Ecology, and it's a very, very impressive document outlining your plans for church growth and the different models that you have. But could you share with us a little bit about the Gen 1K vision that is articulated in that document?
So the Gen 1K vision came about through a process where we really rediscovered our roots. We spent some time revisioning for the future and then restructuring in light of that. And so in 2012, we went through a process as a group of churches, a family of churches, asking that question of who are we? And as we looked at that and spent time unpacking that, we discovered that at the core of who we are is that we're not a denomination. We're a movement. We're an association of churches, which has built within it movement dynamics. So it's not about hierarchical structures, but about relational structures, which really serves and lends itself to church health and church multiplication. And so out of that, rediscovering who we are, we spent some time revisioning and asking questions about what is the future. And through prayer, through connecting with one another, this vision emerged around growing to become 1,000 healthy churches in a generation, that we would stay in line with population growth in New South Wales and the ACT. And as part of that, that every church in our family of churches would be connected to church multiplication in one way or another. That could be as a sending church, it could be through resourcing, through prayer, but that we would all get involved in what this looked like. And with that vision, we then spent some time restructuring around this core identity of interdependence, of regional networks working together, grabbing hold of their own part of the Gen 1K vision, and then working out how to resource that, raise up leaders, and reproduce.
Now that sounds fantastic. And so just unpacking that a little bit further, I understand that the Gen 1K vision would then therefore require the Baptist churches in New South Wales and ACT to pretty well treble in number by the year 2050. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, it's something that we've seen God do in our past. And I think that was part of it. As we reflected on our story, we'd seen that. And we felt, again, through prayer, that this was what he had for us in this next season, tripling.
Yeah, no, that's great. So what have you seen as some of the fruits so far?
Yeah, I think key to this has been the development of our regional networks. So churches, it's similar, I say, to like in a local church. When you want to keep growing, you've got to grow smaller. Yes. And so we see it's really hard for 350 churches to collaborate because there's not that mutual responsibility and accountability that's needed in order to reproduce. So we grew smaller through regional networks of churches, essentially.
Yeah,
and these networks were committed to prayer and relationship with one another. They went through a process of setting their own vision of what it would look like to see the kingdom of God break out in their region as they lived out who we were in that place. And they were committed to resourcing one another and raising up leaders. So there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened. We saw remote Bible colleges come into play, internships where churches shared interns around. Greater West for Christ, which is one of our regions in Western Sydney. Western Sydney is going to be one of the largest cities in Australia, so it's set for huge population growth. They took resource sharing to a whole other level and have started a bunch of social enterprise in order to fund ministry and mission. So there's a landscaping business, a finance business, and one of the benefits of the finance business, as an example, is that they've got chaplaincy set up alongside of it as a key mission strategy, where if your church refinances through that, the trails go to support chaplains in a local school. So it's just thinking creatively about how we can see social enterprise not only have a community impact, but create sustainable ministry models for the future.
No, that's great. A book I read a couple of years ago was by Mark Desmaz, and it was called The Coming Revolution in Church Economics. And that made a very, very strong case for ministries and churches also need to have diversified income streams if we're to pursue our spiritual and also our social mandate into the future, because the traditional sources of income for churches and ministries weren't going to be sufficient in the future to do that. So it sounds like you're absolutely right onto that as well, which is great. What about you're doing a lot of work, which is obvious, doing many different facets to the work. With the church planting, how has that been going? And have you seen sustainability of the churches that you've been planting?
Yeah, so since 2014, we've seen 47 new congregations planted, and that's in all their diversity. So we have simple churches, neighborhood churches, regional churches, resourcing churches, multi-site churches. So when I say congregation, it's not one model, but many different models. So we've seen 47 churches planted over that time, and we've seen an increase in their kind of the 3-year success rate, if you like. And so that's kind of shifted up to around 87, 90% of churches making it past that initial 3-year hurdle. And kind of key to that for us has been a few things. So we have a discernment process or an assessment process like many other organizations. We've moved to embedding that process within local churches. Rather than centralizing that process. It's very much a partnership between us at head office, the local church, and the person and team who are looking at planting. And that conversation builds capacity in the local church as well in terms of identifying church planters and training them up. So we kind of view that very much as a partnership. And so the assessment side of it is then linked with the training side of it. And then these churches are then planted often into networks, which creates that peer support. And we've seen, that help increase that rate of survival beyond that. And then coaching has also been a key part of that, whether it's being coached by a network leader or the coaching that we provide.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think coaching is often one of the hidden essentials, and in my view, every church planter certainly needs a coach, and that's amazingly important in terms of helping the church be sustainable. So I'm interested in the different.
Can I jump in on that coaching thing, Tim, just for a second? One of the things that we learned, because we've been doing coaching now for a number of years, and we found the dynamic between the coach and the planter is really, really important. But we also found that we needed to help the planter get a broader perspective of what is going on and not just be so focused on their own plant, which can often be the case in a coaching relationship. So we kind of built in 3 tiers of coaching, which is coaching that's focused on your immediate context where you work one-on-one with a coach. Then there's peer network or group coaching that helps you see what others are doing at that point in time, kind of peer learning. And then we've got a global strategy where we're connecting through our friends around the world and exposing our planters to what's happening in India or in America. And so it allows them to kind of look in and then out and broaden their perspective and learn from one another and the global church as well, which has been really helpful.
Yeah, no, that's good. So you're connecting with the New Thing Network, I understand, for the global perspective. Is that correct?
We have connected with New Thing, definitely. And part of it's also just connecting with other friends and just calling them in. So you'll get a call at some stage, Tim, I'm sure, to chat with them.
Yeah, no, sounds great. So coming back to the different models, you've mentioned in your work, Blended Ecology, you mentioned 4 different models, and just a moment ago you mentioned another one as well. Tell us about why you think it's important to have different models of church.
Yeah, so models are tools. And so for us, the key thing about having a model is nothing will fit it perfectly. It's actually something that can be applied. And therefore, what you need to do is to consider your context. You need to consider the way God has wired you, so your leadership. And that as you reflect on those things, you can then apply that through the lens of a few different models. So no model is perfect. A model is there as a tool. And but what we found helpful was that by doing some research into a few different models, that it then allowed us to train people and prepare them and discern what would be appropriate for the way God's wired them and the setting that they're going into.
Yeah, that's good. And one of the things I noticed about your models is that your focus on models is about the structure, the different structures of the churches that you want to plant, rather than the style of worship or the style of meeting or the service. And I think that's really good, because the style can change over time. In fact, it needs to change over time, but the structure is often the thing that will inhabit growth or accelerate growth depending on the context. So have you found that some of your models are more appropriate in a particular kind of context? Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we find in like an urban area, for instance, where cost of living is really, really high, and there's often quite a transient community, that pop-up simple churches or micro churches really work in those environments. And by giving them that language of pop-up or simple, it allows it to exist for a season, for a reason, and then to dissolve and be connected into a broader network or a more established church. We've also focusing on, and I know you're chatting with Rick Thorpe as well, and the resourcing church model, and that they work better in densely populated areas, again, based on this transient nature. But then when you think about certain neighborhoods, for instance, that have strong geographical barriers around them, whether it's a waterway or a train line or a major highway, that actually becomes a barrier for people movement. And for instance, I live on the northern beaches of Sydney, and there's this massive road, Pittwater Road, that cuts down the middle and separates the east from the west. And the eastern side is where the beach is, and DY is this kind of beachside community. And we planted a church in this beachside community of DY. And 6 years later, we moved to the western side of Pittwater Road up on the hill. And it takes us about 15 minutes to walk to DY, and it can also take us sometimes 15 minutes to drive to DY, because to cross this main road, it becomes a really, really big barrier. Yes. And so just understanding how people move and kind of the geography of the space led us to think about neighborhood churches, where it's very much about a focus on a local ministry area and working with the neighborhood and what that looks like. And then regional churches work beyond that, where people do travel and they're kind of connected more broadly.
That's good. Tell me about the Garden Network.
Yeah, the Garden Network is an example of this. It's on the Central Coast. There was a church, Narara Valley Baptist Church, that's about 40 years old and had never planted, and in 2017 began thinking about church planting. And in order to do that, they realized that they needed to focus and be intentional around the area of discipleship and leadership development. So they were an early, they were one of the pilot groups of building a discipling culture, which came out of Crossway in Melbourne. And so they did that. And then in 2019, they actually launched their first church plant, which was about 20 minutes down the road. And it was called Greenhouse. But as part of that, they launched a new network, recognizing that actually when you plant in a network, you're able to reproduce more quickly. And so we saw that for them. Within a year to 18 months, they actually planted their second church, meeting ground. And so the two churches worked together to plant the third church. And they're all actually quite different in their expression. And so you've got a regional church, which was the original sending church. You've then got a neighborhood church where people moved into that area and there was a strong sense of place. And then the third church is a multiplying simple church, where people are much more relationally connected across the Central Coast. And its heart really is to reach the spiritual misfits, or those people who we would often use the language around de-church. They don't feel that the church is their home. So what does it look like to connect in people's homes, or to connect in pubs or cafes and those types of places? And so this network would see God's missional wisdom in the diversity of all of these churches working together as an expression on the Central Coast.
Yeah, no, that's great. One last question for you, Jamie. What are you doing to build multiplication into your churches at every level? What's your plan there?
That's a great question, and I'd love to hear your answer on that at some stage too, Tim. I think for me, multiplication is a way of thinking, it's a way of feeling, and it's a way of acting. So it's about our head, our heart, and our hands. And so when it comes to this whole idea of thinking, it's helping leaders dream big, really. A good friend of ours, Pastor Oscar, talks about dreams that make God sweat. Yes, so you've heard that before. And that's because big dreams cause us to ask a completely different set of questions. Big dreams cause us to depend on God in prayer and to partner with others. If your dream is big enough for you to do on your own or with your church, it's not a God-sized dream. It's not a dream that makes God sweat. So I think a key part of that is helping leaders dream big, dream so big that they can't do it on their own, and therefore they need to form these collaborative networks. So we use things like dream pathways, and so that's one thing. It's about helping people think differently. Another thing that's related is around how we feel. And I think it's about embracing love and loss, teaching leaders to embrace love and loss. When you think big, I can remember in a local church setting, we were 1 year into planting. We had 50 people at our 1 year anniversary, and I stood up and said, "Oh, we're going to plant another church." And everyone looked at me like, "Oh, you're crazy. Let's finish planting this one first." But while they dismissed that, for me, it caused me to think differently, that big dream. And I realized that I'm doing all the preaching. If we're going to plant more churches, I need to be doing less preaching, and we need more preachers to do all of this. So I started intentionally investing in preachers. And I ran a preaching internship for that first year, and we trained 4 interns in that space, and we reached out to another local church that we were connected with who had a really great preacher, and I paired them up together. And then the following year I was like, oh, we need even more preachers. So I started a new way of developing leaders. And so by the end of 2 years, we trained up 8 preachers, and they were preaching in other churches and getting experience in our church. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, we've got all of these leaders, what do we do? And so for me, I think about planting churches and that question of when are you ready, when it's actually about leader readiness, isn't it?
Yes.
And so when you've got leaders, church planting takes care of itself.
Yeah.
But in order to get leaders, you have to embrace love, because you have to sow into them. But then you also have to embrace loss.
Yes.
When you're sending people, spiritual sons and daughters that you've sown into, there is a degree of loss. And I think the greatest cost in church planting, which often goes unnamed, and that's been my experience, is the relational cost.
Yeah.
You'll get new people, you'll get the money coming back in, but it's actually the cost of sending people that you deeply love. And then it's a way of acting, I think. And one of the things that we've identified is that if you're going to raise up leaders, it's like parenting. The early stages is about directing, providing clarity on who we are and where we're going and what we do. But it's got to transition from that to focusing on training. And once you've trained and sown into them, you then need to transition your relationship again to one of coaching and drawing out. But often that's where it ends. Actually, the next stage is about releasing. You don't want your kids to be at home with you forever, do you? You want them to be trained up. You want them to be coached. And then you move into this new stage, which is friendship. And so for me, releasing is a key part of that. And I would say that to build in multiplication, you need to, as a leader, build in those different phases of developing others.
Yeah, no, that's great. One of the verses in scripture that's always impacted me with church planting is Genesis 2:24. A man shall leave his mother and his father and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one. Because in that we see that God's model for the propagation of ministry, for the multiplication of ministry. And just like in the natural, we have to be prepared to raise our children so they can actually go out and start their own community. And that's been a very much a stable passage for me over the years in terms of church planting. Yeah,
that's so good.
Jamie,
can I add a story on that, Tim?
I would love you to. Yeah.
Okay, because my parents had this rule when we were growing up, and it was that everyone had to move out when you turned 18. And it wasn't because they didn't love us. It was because they did love us and they were preparing us for adulthood. But that simple goal of having to move out actually reshaped the way that they parented. Yes. And it reshaped the way that we approached learning as kids. So it meant that when we were young, Mum taught us how to cook. And I got into the kitchen. I was like, I need to learn how to cook, because at 18, I need to be able to prepare meals. Otherwise, I'm going to go hungry. And then when she was teaching me how to do the washing, I couldn't even reach the clothesline. They used to have to put something under my feet and I'd have to hang it on there. But for me, there was a sense of purpose in that learning. And so that simple goal of having to move out by the age of 18 reshaped the way that they taught and reshape the way that we learn. And I think often as churches and as leaders, we expect people to still be living at home when they're 40, 50, 60. And yet if we embrace this idea and this posture of that we're actually just stewarding people for a season, and that God has a new family for them, and that we want to do that in partnership and relationship, which is really at the heart of what you're saying there in terms of be fruitful, come together, be fruitful and multiply.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that's good. And, I know that my children, who are all grown, grown now, they're all adults now, their culture comes from mine and my wife's, but it's different. Their DNA is likewise different, which means that they're actually equipped to be able to reach people that I can't. And I shouldn't try to, probably, because it's they're far better positioned to it. Just one last thought for you. Ralph Moore, in his book New to Five, Ralph has planted a handful of churches across North America. You're probably aware of that. But out of those churches, there are about 2,800 churches have been planted over the years. And in New to Five, he unpacks the journey, and he talks about another sense of loss. You were mentioning loss. But it's a multiplication. To be successful, you've got to be prepared to lose excellence, or some of your excellence. for example, in terms of putting up preachers. I bet the people that you were putting onto the platform to preach weren't at your standard, but you ended up with multiplication as they were being developed through that whole process. But you had to be prepared to let go of that standard. Doesn't mean that it mightn't be good, but it's different, isn't it? And it's risky.
Yeah.
Jamie,
yeah.
any final pieces of wisdom for us before we finish off?
I think ending on Rouse wisdom is a great way to end, Tim. That's brilliant.
Well, here's just a free plug, but that ebook of his is available free of charge on the Exponential Australia website as well. And I reckon it's one of the best books that we can read in terms of church planning and understanding how multiplication, the principles of multiplication, can come through. Jamie, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I know you're going on leave tomorrow, but being in lockdown, I suppose you're probably not traveling very far at all. And that's
no.
But really
just a few more walks.
Yeah, appreciate you and appreciate the wisdom that you shared with us today. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Tim, for the invitation. It's good to chat.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.